Good to be with you again. I see Charlotte and David and Walt, who've been meeting every other week for purposes of fomenting a political revolution, so it's good to see your smiling faces. And I admire any group that can put a microphone into Walt's hand and think they're going to get out by noon. That was a courageous gesture on the part of Joe. And thank you for singing Love Will Guide Us, because on Labor Day weekend, that Sunday, I was the service leader at our Ormond UU. We had 4 speakers from the congregation talking about their work lives. And I suppose it was unconsciously, but I skipped the second hymn, which was Love Will Guide Us. It was at the top of my page, and I think I just went on to Joyce, not noticing it up there. But it turned out that we finished on time as a result of that, but I felt bad. I felt guilty, you know, that we missed that, so I got to sing it this morning. Thank you. This was a relatively recent issue of Time magazine that was asking the question, are we still back in the 1960s as far as our relationships among the races in America? This was soon after the Ferguson incident. These kinds of clashes between police and embittered citizens have become a staple of contemporary American life. It goes back for decades. We see these headlines, we read the cover stories, we naturally wonder what could be done. What steps can we take to alleviate the obvious disconnect between the life we envision for ourselves and for America and the sad and violent reality that afflicts so many people living at or near the poverty line especially. So we search for answers, and a question creeps into our minds. How close are we in Florida, in Volusia County, in New Smyrna Beach, to becoming the next Ferguson? The next community where smoldering resentment explodes into tragic violence. And then the question becomes, what can I do? What can we do? A 55-year-old white woman named Tracy from Austin, Texas, asked that question in writing to nationally syndicated newspaper columnist Leonard Pitts, Jr. His column appears in the News Journal occasionally. And Leonard happens to be African American, and here's a white woman from Texas asking him, what can I do about this kind of violence? What can I do about police violence against African American men that I'm seeing in the news today, week by week and month by month? Well, in a sidebar to this Time magazine story, Tavis Smiley, the public television interviewer, whom we watch practically every time he's on, he marvels at how little we have done in the past 50 years to deal with the root causes of the smoldering violence that erupts in our cities. Tavis and Dr. Cornell West took time out from their lives to spend time in cities like Detroit and Newark and places where there seems to have been very little progress. They visited impoverished areas around the country and wrote about what they found. And in this sidebar to this Time magazine article, Tavis writes, in view of the persistence of this violence decade upon decade, we must find the courage to address what kind of nation we want to be. If we don't have the courage to do that, then I shudder to think what happens to America in the coming months and years. Well, in response to that question from the woman in Texas, what can I do? Leonard Pitts decided to devote a series of his newspaper columns to that question. And one thing he decided to do was pose the question to a man he trusts, Reverend Tony Lee, who had a delegation of 200 African American men that he led to Capitol Hill earlier this year to talk to their legislators about issues that impact their lives. Issues such as racially stratified policing, the need for education reform, and the suppression of voting rights. Reverend Lee responded to Leonard Pitts as follows: I have a framework for people like Tracy and for others who are asking, what can I do? It's educate, advocate, and participate. Never minimize the importance of talking to people around you about the things that disturb you, Reverend Lee says. Talk with the people that you deal with daily. Educate yourselves on the issues. And then ask friends and neighbors to share what they're learning. Finally, become an advocate by talking to people who are in decision-making authority in your region. If those decision makers hear white people expressing concern about the inequities and injustices that plague your community, it can bring those problems to the forefront much more dramatically. And then the clincher, according to Reverend Lee, participate. Educate, advocate, and then participate. Get connected. Join other concerned citizens, volunteering your time and donating your resources to organizations that are carrying out good work on those issues that concern you. And I hear many of you whispering under your breath, that's exactly what we've been doing in Are You Your Church and in Volusia County. There's an organization called Faith that you may be aware of, fighting against injustice through harmony. And our particular UU group is very dedicated to the work that Faith does. Faith educates itself, does research on a particular concern, and then advocates for change by holding an evening in which the politicians, county councils sit and are grilled by the members of Faith in front of thousands of members who've gathered. And then we participate by donating time and money to Faith to facilitate the ongoing effort of addressing key issues. Typically it's a new issue every year. Affordable housing was one year's issue. Excessive incarceration of young black men. These are the kinds of key issues that could ward off, if we address them, the worst in our communities. So it certainly seems as if UUs nationally and locally are doing good work, and I just think we should take a moment to pat ourselves on the back, and at that point take a deep breath. Embrace yourself, because that's not really the best news that we've got. The best news is there's more to do. And when you educate yourself on the subject of community participation to answer the question, what can I do, or what can we do, you run smack dab into some people who are saying very few people these days are participating in civic organizations. Very few people take advantage of the opportunity to do something. I read 2 books by Robert Putnam. Actually, we saw him in a television report the other day for the first time on CBS Sunday Morning. Putnam wrote a book in year 2000 called Bowling Alone, and then he wrote this year, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. The bad news that Putnam has uncovered by studying the work of sociological researchers and gathering information from polls and interviewing people in communities across the country is this: the kind of civic participation that's needed to combat de facto segregation by class in America, which is one of our greatest problems, that kind of participation is in steep decline. Generations of Americans have benefited from the effort to be involved in each other's lives. They've been involved in efforts to improve schools, clean up neighborhoods, provide facilities for the benefit of all. But we now live in an America in which lack of involvement is the norm. In past generations, the term family might have referred to an extended group of 6 to 10 people living under the same roof, rubbing shoulders with each other day by day. People interacted closely in extended families and benefited from the collective wisdom of the group. In neighborhoods, people were looking out for each other's welfare, providing a safe haven for children, for new mothers, for the elderly. And people were encountering each other in other contexts as well. If we go back 40 or 50 years, we find that 70% of Americans attended at least one civic meeting per month, served on a committee in a civic or fraternal organization, or serving as an officer of one of those organizations. Putnam has found that those generations of participators are dying off, being replaced by recent generations in which barely 20% of Americans are directly civically engaged. We participators are not replacing ourselves as we age. Neighborhood involvement has dropped precipitously. Yogi Berra, who grew up in the Italian community in St. Louis, warns us in his own inimitable way about the consequences of neglecting our neighborhood responsibilities. Yogi says, if you don't go to a guy's funeral, he won't go to yours. Don't think about that too long. The Yogi's point is that being a good neighbor involves a sense of responsibility for each other within the neighborhood. A neighborhood is not just a collection of houses, after all. The people in those houses can make a difference in each other's lives if they're willing to be involved. Now, I'm very much aware of the fact that I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm in a room full of people who on a regular basis renew a covenant to live and learn together and to help one another. We use our people involved in the collective process of educating ourselves for our mutual betterment. We are advocates for positive change. We are participants in an era when civic participation is very low as a priority for most people. Unless, of course, someone threatens the sacred right to drive on the beach. Then people show up to meetings and make a lot of noise. But please consider the community causes to which people who are associated with UU locally are involved. In our own group, we've got people who are advocating for Family Renew, which houses homeless families. Shoes That Fit puts new shoes on children going back to school each year. Halifax Urban Ministries, I believe this is Home Sunday. The Alliance in our group works with the Community Partnership for Children, which helps to place, brings children out of difficult homes and then tries to get them replaced once things have been worked on, or finds better places for them. So, and I know we've got members and officers from the Audubon Society chapters in Volusia County, the Sierra Club, and the ACLU. I'm sure I've left out many other local causes that people in this room serve with their time and money and resources. But the point is that we've touched lives in positive ways with our service to these organizations. There are additional unmet needs in the community, however, if we extend our sense of community to everyone who lives in this county. Putnam's thesis in the book, Our Kids, is that a disturbing percentage of young people in America are growing up with no trustworthy adults in their lives. They are children of fragmented families, fragmented neighborhoods, fragmented communities. With no safe ground to stand on, they propel themselves forward into the streets, leading lives that would vector toward violence, imprisonment, and early death. Father Greg Boyle is a Catholic cleric who counsels gang members in LA's inner city. He heads an organization called Homeboy Industries, which employs former gang members in a constellation of businesses, from silkscreen printing to a farmer's market to a bakery. But he also puts them into therapy in the hope that psychiatric care will help them to quell their inner demons. When you've spent your childhood in hell, you have nothing to lose when you hit the streets as a gang member. Father Boyle has figured out that values such as respect for human life that seem automatic to us can simply be incomprehensible to a young person who cannot name a single adult who cares. You're probably like me in being able to say that you grew up with the understanding that there were many adults who cared about you. You can name several people who contributed substantially to your development during your formative years. But there are children in our community who have received no such support. A child of neglect is an aggregation of unmet needs. That child has to be convinced that he or she has a self that is defined not by the next violent encounter in the streets, but by the care that someone has taken to carve out a loving niche for the child. Let me give an illustration of the difference that can be made in the life of a child by a more forgiving environment than what many children encounter in communities across America. I earned my undergraduate degree at Tulane University in New Orleans. The school, like the city, has had to rebuild itself in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. Not long ago, Tulane invited a local musician named Trombone Shorty to address the convocation of graduating students. This young, vibrant, creative African-American musician got his nickname by playing trombone in a street corner band at the tender age of 5 years old. Trombone Shorty is not short now, but he was then. What was he doing playing trombone in the streets at the age of 5? Well, as he puts it, they needed a trombone player and the money was good. For generations, neighborhoods in New Orleans have been defined by the type of music they produce. And that has meant that when it might seem that there was nowhere to turn for a young person, there was nurture in those neighborhoods that could take their place in the musical community. In 2005, when the hurricane hit and the flooding reached epic proportions, the people in those neighborhoods were scattered to the four winds. But Shorty proudly points to the way the community's bouncing back today. The New Orleans that he grew up in was no utopia, but his neighborhood fostered a degree of safety and mentoring that provided him with a living and a genuine sense of self. Now Shorty's giving back to that musical community that fostered him, even as he's reaching out to the larger community with the message that young people who are being denied a sense of self need to be saved by those of us who have the ability to help. Can that kind of nurture be restored to those at the bottom of the economic ladder? Well, Robert Putnam seems to be in concert with politicians like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in stating that it can be done if we will find the national will to restore a living wage to working class America. When they asked Robert Putnam in interviews after he published the book what would be the silver bullet, what would turn this around, he said, decent wages for working people. The simple act of providing birth control can help young people to delay having children until they can better afford them, and that makes a big difference in a community. Providing central daycare facilities for working parents can add another layer to the support system for the children of those parents. The effort to fortify our communities against senseless violence is not rocket science. It does require common sense to establish structure in the lives of children who are now being left to fend for themselves. A 5-year-old playing music on a street corner is not a lost child if he has an entire community looking out for him. A 5-year-old in a single-parent family in which that parent is working 2 jobs and has no time to sit at the table for a meal with her children, that child may have no one looking out for him or her. That child may well head to the streets unsupervised. What can I do? What can we do? How can we become a part of a community that includes that child? Well, let's state the obvious. We're going nowhere as a state and as a nation if our representatives in government regard it as their duty to shut down, in the name of lower taxes, programs like Head Start, programs that provide breakfast and lunch at school for those in need, programs that provide prenatal counseling to young parents, programs that supply music and art instruction in the public schools, programs that provide after-school activities for children whose parents work late. We have created a permanent underclass in this country. The consequences will be with us until we make government work for the people, rather than for the owners of the burgeoning industry involved in building private prisons and stocking them with casualties from our culture of neglect. We can interrupt this horrid chain of events, but only when we find the resolve to educate, advocate, and participate in the effort to foster not just our own children, but all of the children. A child growing up in Volusia County with no one to trust is not someone else's problem. That child is a member of our extended family. That child deserves our attention, our mentoring, our care. Robert Putnam talks a lot in his book about the dwindling away of America's social capital. He has studied the atrophy of social networks. That decline in our sense of community has coincided with the disappearance of decent pay and blue-collar jobs in places like his hometown of Port Clinton, Ohio. Port Clinton happens to be my grandmother's hometown, up on the shores of Lake Erie. I visited there 2 summers ago to understand a little bit more about my own roots. In the post-World War II era, Port Clinton produced a generation of young people from all social strata, most of whom took advantage of educational opportunities and went on to lead productive lives. But the town has been strangled over the past years by the loss of its economic base. Now the jobs have been systematically outsourced abroad. The factories closed and locked up. When the money dwindles to a trickle, the social networks that are necessary to launch children into the world disappear. Robert Putnam and I grew up in an Ohio in which opportunity existed for young people in a way that it no longer exists. In Port Clinton, in New Smyrna Beach, in Ormond Beach, we can do something about that. Educate, advocate, participate. I'm going to close by quoting the words of a gentleman named Claude Fisher on the subject of social networks. Dr. Fisher holds a wonderful position in the academic community. He's a sociologist of friendship. A sociologist of friendship. That sounds like a license to be happy, doesn't it? What he points out sounds obvious, but it's certainly worth keeping in mind. He says social networks are important in all of our lives. Often for finding jobs. More often for finding a helping hand. Difference in providing a social network in our community that will extend a helping hand, that will provide each child with a sense that he or she matters to someone, to us.